of English at the University of Utah. She is the author of Singing in a Strange Land, a Jewish American Poetics, as well as numerous articles in journals such as AJS Review, Proof Text, and PMLA on poetry, religion, and Jewish thought. Recently, she was a senior Fulbright scholar at Haifa University. Currently, Professor Shreiber is working on a monograph called Holy Envy, writing in the Jewish-Christian Borderzone, and a co-edited collection of essays and annotated translations focusing on the relation between prayer and contemporary Hebrew poetry. We have just finished a great and inspiring seminar, a room away from here, with Shaul Magid as a respondent to Maeera's chapter, which is going to be also part of her talk tonight, I believe. And we had numerous scholars of diverse age and experience joining us this afternoon. So it looks like with this marathon, we will do tonight what we do best here. Discuss, share stories, remember, laugh, and hopefully open up new conversations. This is as much about this evening as it is about the mission of the Center for Jewish History. Being home to the extraordinary archival collections of our 5 partner organizations, American Jewish Historical Society, American Sephardi Federation, Leo Baeck Institute, YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and Yeshiva University Museum, we all collaborate to preserve history, nourish scholarship, and facilitate conversations. We strive to constantly move between the academically rigorous and the publicly friendly, helping raise questions that help make sense of the world we live in, and create a safe, open, historically informed space to address these questions together. It is this that gives us a luxury to move beyond numerous borders and look for spaces of experiment, uncomfortable questions, and intellectual restlessness, which is also thanks to the courtesy of our archives, and which is also going to inform our evening tonight. To me, this evening is as academic as it is personal, as the Borderzone happens to inform my own biography. Please join us for a wonderful evening to come, and afterwards for a small reception, and hopefully more stories and more questions. Thank you, Maeera.
Thank you, Marc. Okay, everybody can hear me?
Yes.
Great, that's most important. So first of all, I will not try to pronounce your name in all its glory, but I want to thank Malgo very much. Since she's come to the Center for Jewish History, I think the energy and the innovation of really reaching out to scholars like myself and making a space for us to share our work has been so very important, and the archives are truly a treasure. So thank you for all you do to bringing us here this evening together. So as Malgo already explained to you, the talk I'm going to give this evening, there's 2 parts to it. The first part is really a general introduction to some of the issues that I'm raising in my book, which is currently called Holy Envy, Writing in the Jewish-Christian Borderzone. And then the second part is going to be a little bit more of an in-depth study of an author who you may know, Sholem Asch. So I'll get started. Okay. Holy envy. This is what is missing from most interfaith encounters, at least according to the prominent theologian Krister Stendahl. Calling for a more active, demanding, effective condition than the dispassionate tolerance that typically presides over most interfaith meetings. Stendahl challenges us to be genuinely vulnerable to recognizing that there may be something out there that is lacking in our own tradition or one's own tradition, and to risk experiencing in all of its pain and discomfort the shameful condition we call envy. Now, I first came across this interesting locution called holy envy while I was reading the editor's introduction, and we'll see whether this works. There you go. To the Jewish annotated New Testament. Do many of you guys know about this book? It's fascinating. I'm so glad to bring you the good word. Okay, in which the editors, let's see, you can see them or not there, Amy Jill Levine and Marc Brettler, confess to having experienced holy envy as a result of immersing themselves in the wisdom and world of the New Testament. The volume is really remarkable and worth looking at. By presenting the new revised standard edition of the text with a running commentary of a group of 50 Jewish scholars of Christian and Jewish antiquity, along with a set of essays exploring different topics such as Jesus in modern Jewish thought and Midrash and parables in the New Testament, the editors provide wide access to important new developments in Jewish and Christian inquiry. Judaism and Christianity. Now, of course, these traditions actually have been engaged in a much messier, more interesting kinds of theological and cultural entanglement. In this sense, and I'm going to call the book J-Ant potentially offers useful strategies for sorting out a more nuanced relationship between Judaism and Christianity. But this is not the whole argument fueling J-Ant, which has been celebrated in Jewish publications like the Jewish Review of Books and Tablets as an epical achievement. Some people have even called it a small miracle. Instead, the target audience for this book skews decidedly Jewish, at least according to the book's introduction. And in this way, it effectively blunts the disquieting feelings this book means to provoke. We are told at the outset, the readers, and this is in the introduction, that the readers of J-Ant may be in a better position to be good neighbors, part of a larger fellowship of goodwill. But there is more. It seems that J-Ant may make us, Jews, better consumers of Western high culture. To quote, to appreciate fully Bach's masterpieces. It helps to know the texts upon which they are based. Familiarity with the infancy narratives in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke helps readers to appreciate the magnificent portraits of the Madonna and our child, and so on. Moreover, the editor suggests that J-Ant may make us better Jews, as we will discover, quote, why most Jews did not follow Jesus or the movement that developed in his name. In other words, we made the right choice. Even as they, the editors, note that there are all kinds of real wisdom and insight contained in these pages, many of these passages are renderings of basic, ongoing Jewish values, and that's a quote, like love of God, love of neighbor, and repairing the world. That is, J-Ant invites us to engage the other as a rather cozy version of the self. And this is certainly one way of construing the relational stance underwriting the invoked, evocative, and complex notion known as holy envy. But with this term, the Swedish Bishop Stendhal, who coined it again, means us to understand, I think, that real interfaith encounters require much more than mutual tolerance. Rather, such meetings demand that one be not merely open to recognizing what is admirable about one's faith tradition, other than one's own, but also open to actively recognizing that a different tradition has features absent from one's tradition, thus acknowledging a genuine lack and recognizing an object of desire and maybe envy. Sometimes such cross-religious forays, as we shall see, can be more challenging, more painful, and finally, more risky. A radical parting of the ways, a fundamentally asymmetrical relationship. Up until 20 years ago, These were the phrases that dominated most academic accounts of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, especially in the annals of early Jewish history. But the model has been thoroughly revised, and you may well know some of these scholars, people like Daniel Boyarin, Philip Alexander, Paula Fredrickson, and Peter Schaefer. All of these scholars have been busily mining the depths of writings in the Tannaitic period, which spans roughly from the late 1st century to the early part of the 4th century, to show how it was once described as a radical parting of the ways, a static model of relationship which casts Judaism as the parent of Christianity, the child who left home without looking back, is considerably messier, more fluid, and more interesting dynamic mode of relation. Now, Daniel Boyarin likens the relationship to that of twins joined at the hip with no surgeon in sight. In wake of this paradigm shift, a number of disciplinary fields, including theology and modern Jewish history, have begun re-examining their own respective accounts of Jewish-Christian inquiry. But this revisionary model has yet to have any real impact on Jewish literary studies, which is lucky for me, especially when it comes to modernism, which is one of my fields of interest. Rather than understanding the interaction as one characterized by vibrant interplay, most modernist literary studies still presume an antagonistic model, whereby each religion vies for sovereignty. In other words, we haven't progressed much beyond Leslie Fiedler's harsh take in 1983 on writers who forsake, quote, authentically Jewish tradition, and instead turn towards what he describes as Jewish Christology, it's kind of a hard phrase, in search of a mythological frame for celebrating the suffering artiste. Consider, for example, poet-critic Rachel Blau-du-Plessis' recent call for a careful investigation of how modern literary culture embodies a Christianizing structure of feeling. A culture dominated, of course, by T.S. Eliot and what she calls his callow mix of universalist yet exclusionary aims. Although separated by more than 30 years, Blau-du-Plessis, like Fiedler, seems to assume that Jewishness and Christianness are fundamentally separable and at odds with each other. Now, I'm really drawn to what Blau-du-Plessis is calling for, this kind of investigation. But I don't envision placing Jewish texts on some kind of continuum, Judaism here and Christianity here, in the interest of assessing how far they have strayed or to what extent a given piece of work may have submitted to an oppressive Christian narrative underwriting literary studies. Instead of viewing Christianity as an aesthetically coercive force, to be indulged or tolerated or resisted, I propose a more nuanced approach. For as scholars have recently observed, these religious borders, long viewed as absolute, are produced through language. By exploring literary texts that flourish in the fissures marking the Jewish-Christian Borderzone, literary texts that dwell in this place of in-betweenness, in the in-between place between languages, cultures, and religion, I want to pursue Daniel Boyarin's important question. What creative use can be made of problematic desire, which is how he casts the Jewish-Christian interaction? Not only what pleasures does it engender, but also what use can it be in the world, and what aches, I might add. That is, how do these texts deepen our understanding of the challenges, demands, and rewards of engaging the religious other? Thank you. Good, wrong way. There we go, good. Problematic desire. Indeed, As it turns out, the Jewish-Christian Borderzone is rife with language of affect, provoking emotions such as desire, envy, anxiety, fury, and more. Let me illustrate briefly through a case study just how high emotions run in this debate. Among the many scholars excavating this rough terrain, Bjorn has been especially articulate when it comes to naming just how emotionally demanding these forays can be. Even as I am indebted to his work for helping revise an important chapter in the history of religion, I'm also fascinated by the large contours of his academic journey and how it speaks to my own concerns. 24 years ago, Bjorn, known then mostly as a remarkably innovative reader of Talmud, took it upon himself to wrestle with the letters of Paul. This encounter, as chronicled in A Radical Jew, it's an early book, A Radical Jew, Paul and the Politics of Identity, is notably antagonistic, since Bjorn, who identifies as an Orthodox Jew, approaches Paul as one of Judaism's most powerful internal interlocutors. The book, now a classic in religious studies, helps initiate important new ways of thinking about Paul's role in shaping Jewish-Christian thought. But it also marks an important shift in Bjorn's own scholarly pursuits. What could have just been an intellectual detour, a brief respite from the hard work of standard Talmudic inquiry, becomes a major preoccupation, a passion verging on an obsession. 5 years later finds Bjorn in the thick of it, as in the opening pages of Dying for God, Martyrdom, and the Making of Christianity and Judaism, he struggles mightily to cast off such familial metaphors as the well-rehearsed account of Christianity as the daughter of Judaism, in search of something more dynamic, less stable, some metaphor that will capture his own complicated feelings about a religion that he has been taught to regard as reliably other. 5 more years, and I couldn't figure out how to put up all his books up here because there's a lot of them, so I just put up 2. 5 years later, and borderlines the partition of what he calls then Judeo-Christianity appears. Bjorn, who is given to confessional interpolations, or what he describes as a predilection for wearing his heart on his sleeve, decides now to quote-unquote come out and confess to a strange attraction, again his quote, to being, quote, in love with some manifestations of Christianity. A, quote, problematic desire that he likens not entirely unlike the love that binds an abusive couple to another. I didn't write it. A love that almost would not dare to say its name. The love of an Orthodox Jew for Christianity. Bjorn describes his tangled desire for Christianity as a kind of nostalgia, a yearning not so much for a different place, but for a different time. A time where the boundaries between these two traditions seemed less absolute. Like most lovers, Bjorn wants to share his story with the world. This impulse informs his next expedition, which is the Jewish Gospels, the story of the Jewish Christ. A more accessible, user-friendly rendition of his academic efforts to blend the idea of Jesus as a divine savior in favor of something much less scary or off-putting, at least to a Jewish readership. For he effectively upends Christian doctrine, redefining the well-known locution Son of Man to mean divine redeemer, arguing that many of Christianity's core beliefs, including that of resurrection, originate in pre-Christian Jewish thought. To put it another way, it is a love that knows no limits. Writing out of a desire to make vivid just how blurry the boundaries between Judaism and Christianity really are, Boyarin comes close to erasing the differences altogether. The Jewish Gospels sets off a firestorm. As another esteemed scholar of late antiquity, Peter Schaeffer, lets loose, writing in the pages of the New Republic, grieving how this, quote, wildly speculative and highly idiosyncratic book leaves him, quote, irritated and sad. For by charting a surprisingly smooth path between the true traditions, the Jewish Gospels short circuits the more challenging, complicated narrative of which, ironically enough, Boyarin himself had been a principal author. I know. To be sure, Schaeffer's objections are thoroughly grounded in sound scholarship and mounted in the interest of academic integrity. And in this arena, such exchanges are hardly unique, where highly charged interactions are part of the landscape. But the degree to which emotions become part of the discursive language when Jewish-Christian convergences and divergences are at stake is really interesting, at least to me. Part 2. In a longer version of this discussion, I take some turns and I map out some important moments focusing on the quest for a historical Jesus and the long resistance to the notion of porous religious boundaries. But in the interest of our time together this evening, I'm going to fast forward a bit, and I'm going to start with this image that you may be tired of, but I still think it's worth looking at. There we go. There it is. Okay. Marc Chagall's 1938 painting, The White Crucifixion, one of at least 20 images of his featuring the Jewish Jesus. Reflecting back on his nearly 30 years obsession with this figure, Chagall says, for me, Christ always symbolized the true type of the Jewish martyr. That's how I understood him in 1908 when I used this figure for the first time. It was under the influence of the pogroms. That is, the way I understand it, Chagall works to jam the machinery of anti-Semitism by confronting his largely Christian audience with an image that, since his Jesus Christ is so clearly marked as Jewish, will disable any kind of the essentialist othering underwriting anti-Semitic violence by forcing the Christian self to recognize both Jesus and oneself in the Semite other. To be sure, this is an arresting, even shocking move. Nevertheless, the religious categories of Christian and Jewish remain more or less intact, at least as far as the artist is concerned. But the painting's contemporary reception suggests that a more complex account may be in order. A few years ago, the Art Institute of Chicago, where the painting now hangs, announced that they were shipping the work to Florence at the request of Pope Francis, who has proclaimed White Crucifixion to be his favorite work of art, and specifically asked that it be included in a show devoted to divine beauty. That is, even as an artist may claim to be invested in shoring up religious boundaries, the viewer's gaze can work to very different ends. These boundaries, as with most boundaries, are fundamentally unstable. Now, while for Chagall, Christian and Jewish remain separate, boundary categories, but Chagall's good friend, the writer Sholem Asch, he envisions a much more nuanced, muddled, and interesting model of interaction. It's an effort that arguably cost him his career. Born in a small Polish town in 1880, Asch turned away early from his traditional Jewish upbringing and joined the ranks of the secular Yiddish literati. Heralded as a wunderkind, Asch became known as a gifted storyteller and above all as a dramatist. Even as he delighted his readership with idyllic tales of traditional Jewish life, it seemed that he was always drawn to cultural border zones. In the summer of 1906, he wrote The God of Vengeance, and some of you may have seen Indecent, so you know all about this, right? So it's a Yiddish language play which has been described as Broadway's first lesbian kiss. Situating his tale in the Jewish-owned brothel, Asch bundles same-sex attraction, interfaith relations, and illicit sexual dalliances all into one tragic affair, and as one might imagine, the play generated strong response. New York audiences threw eggs, while tastemakers, such as Abe Gehane, who was the editor of the Yiddish neighborhood, The Forwards, championed Asch's bold and artful achievement. Undeterred by this decidedly mixed response, Asch became even more prolific. And I'll see whether I can put you a picture here of him. There he is. Okay, that's what he looks like. So he was undeterred by this response, but he became even more productive. As if energized by controversy, he published more than 30 works of fiction and dramatic work between the years 1906 and 1939. And then in 1939, he came out with, not that, but he came out with The Nazarene. The novel, and this is the first of a Christological trilogy, right? So 3 books. The novel, along with its companions, Mary and the Apostle, precipitated a storm of abuse that made the God of Vengeance look like a summer shower, at least as far as Asch's Yiddish readership was concerned. Indeed, the novel first appeared in English, and this is complicated. Why English, not Yiddish? Perhaps we'll talk about it, but at least here, I think it was because it was too disturbing for Asch's usual constituency. Informed by a worldview in which the idea of a hyphenated Judeo-Christian culture had already been taking root, English language Jewish intellectuals such as Philip Roth and Alfred Kazin wrote kind but restrained accounts of Asch's efforts to infuse the Christian epic, quote, with a sense of Jewish loneliness. That's what Kazin said. Turning, however, to the realm of Yiddish letters, one discovers a world ablaze as Abe Gehane declares war on the author who was once a star player for the home team. Among the many shots fired, Gehane is most often quoted for wickedly observing that Asch's, and you'll forgive my Yiddish here, Yiddishkeit is Yiskukeit. Yisukite. That is, his Jewishness is Jesusness. Yeah. The attacks continue, culminating with Chaim Lieberman's 300-page assault, published first in Yiddish, then translated into English. It begins, Americans have their Ezra Pound, he was a fascist, Jews have Sholem Asch. Right. Lieberman directs much of his firepower at Asch's failure to point up the various instances upon which the New Testament misrepresents Judaism, but buried in all the ire are some real insights into what fuels this kind of vitriol and what makes Asch's effort so compelling. Lieberman writes, quote, "From a purely artistic standpoint, it was a serious error to, quote, blur the very sharp distinctions between the two viewpoints. His work would have gained considerably in stature had he dared speak up for Judaism with boldness, meeting the Christian issue squarely." Now, as Anita Norwich understands it, some of you may know her amazing work, the real issue driving this ferocity was fear that the nascent formulation of Judeo-Christianity and what it would mean for Yiddish culture in America. In Asch's case, the ironies, I think, are even more profound. For Yiddish, the stuff out of which Asch writes his tales and weaves his stories is itself what Max Weinreich has called a language of fusion. To begin with, it's a polylingual, mongrel construction born in the border zones between several cultures, classes, national affiliations, and linguistic registers. That is, by its very register, it seems, at least to me, that Yiddish should have been hospitable to the kinds of border crossings upon which Asch embarked. This is especially true since Asch is writing in America, where Yiddish writers were often in dialogue with other aesthetic movements, and some, most notably those who called themselves the introspectivists, found themselves in the American poetic vanguard. Along with a penchant for aesthetic innovation, many of these writers, who ironically are not included Gladstein, we'll talk about him in a minute, many of these writers routinely push the boundaries of their received literary culture by turning to non-Jewish writers and thinkers, including T.S. Eliot and James Joyce, as sources of inspiration. That said, Asch faced an enormous amount of resistance. It took 4 years after the novel appeared in English to even find a Yiddish publisher who was willing to take the novel on. This bit of publishing history is instructive for my purposes, for it was not a matter simply of marketing or opportunity. Rather, it reflects Asch's deep conviction that although he was distressed by American materialism, he also believed that America, quote, was the healthiest country in a sick world. We can aspire. Okay? And it was therefore the most likely place for the Jewish, what he called the Jewish-Christian ideal, to take root and to thrive. Now, at the same time, while Asch was writing, there were a number of American Yiddish writers who were wary of a growing inclination to embrace the universal at the expense of the particular. More urgently, as the catastrophe brewing in Europe began to be understood, some Yiddish luminaries insisted on claiming Jewishness, which was in the danger of being erased. Yaakov Gladstein's most famous poem, and I have just a little tiny bit of it here. There it is. This is the beginning part of it, called Goodnight World, written in 1938, provides one of the strongest examples of the enraged rejection of Christian modernity and the desperate, tortured, deeply ambivalent turn towards traditional Judaism, Yiddishkeit, that this knowledge engendered. So I'm just going to read you the first part of it, and then I'll read the other part of it. Good night, wide world, big, stinking world. Not you, but I slammed the gate in my long robe with my flaming yellow patch, with my proud gait. At my own command, I returned to the ghetto. And he wrote that when he came back from visiting his mother, who was dying, and he saw what was happening in Poland specifically. So here's the last bit, I'm just going to read it to you. The last bit in the speaker's bitter protest lodged against those icons of Western civilization which had betrayed him so thoroughly. He says, and just listen, "Good night, I grant you world, all my liberators, take the Jesus Marxes, choke on their courage, drop dead on a drop of our baptized blood. I do not need consolation. I go back to my four walls, from Wagner's pagan music to tune to humming. I kiss you, tangled Jewish life." As the Jewish world begins to grasp the full extent of the horror, Gladstein begins redrawing the cultural religious boundaries that as a modernist poet, he had happily abandoned. Goodnight World finds the poet directing his fury towards both Jews and Christians alike for falling prey to those seductive visions of those Jesus Marxes. And it's a locution he makes up. 6 years later, however, any nonpartisan impulses have thoroughly dissipated, along with any pangs of doubt he may have suffered, as in a subsequent poem that's called How Much Christian, he pointedly refuses to participate in any of these impieties offered on behalf of those who suffered, scoffing bitterly. And this is Gladstein. How much Christian, so to speak, can I get? How much pity was left me, and what can I forgive? And to those who would murmur sympathetically and suggest that perhaps something like Christian forgiveness is in order, Gladstein speaker concedes, quote, so much pity they can still get out of me for the children of my leprous enemies. This pinch of sympathy, take it from me, toss. That, however, is as far as he can go. As the last line makes clear, he adamantly refuses to indulge in any of the Christianizing symbols which typically present themselves as universalizing gestures of goodwill. This is the last line. But do not shadow my heart with a pitiful cross. Okay. The issue for Gladstein is not so much one of religious devotion. He remains, like so many Yiddish writers, staunchly secular, but rather thoroughly convinced that Nazi ideology is deeply bound up with Christian doctrine. Gladstein insists on laying blame where it belongs. Drawing a firm boundary around Christianity, Gladstein provides an important framework for understanding just why Asch, and you're going to go back to Asch now. I'll put it back up there so you don't get distracted. Why his project was so incendiary. A Yiddish writer like Gladstein, Asch took it upon himself to blur boundaries in the interest of imagining a redemptive solution to a world drenched in violence. His response ran counter to the fury and outrage that seized the larger Jewish community. It seemed indeed to smack of the naive assimilationist mindset that may have helped the disaster to spread so widely and quickly. Now, some critics cast Asch in the role of perpetual contrarian. He liked to provoke, someone who craved attention, even of the negative kind. But I want to suggest that perhaps there was something deeper and a kind of redemptive reading. While living in France, Asch addressed a large anti-Nazi protest in 1933 and continued to live in Europe off and on until 1939, when it became clear that staying would be impossible. He also visited Palestine, first in 1927 and then again in 1939, and was very appreciative of the youthful pioneering spirit he encountered there among the Zionist settlers. But he didn't embrace Zionism as a, quote, solution to the perennial Jewish problem. Even more importantly, he rejected what he saw as the weak messianism underwriting the establishment of a Jewish homeland, which argued for global salvation as the natural outcome of a seemingly ordinary turn of events. Instead, Asch believed in what he called, quote, the messianic mystery, requisite to humanity's redemption. And I think it's this belief in messianic mystery that informs his passionate endorsement of the Jewish-Christian ideal. He wrote this in 1945. It was a long book about it's called A Destiny, an epistle to the Christians. He says, first, the most important reason for the hatred of the Jews is the separate faith which has isolated them. The best way to remedy this desperate state of affairs is to focus not merely on what Judaism and Christianity have in common, but to insist that the two religions need each other, not just to survive, but to thrive. And this is what he says. The preservation of Israel and the preservation of the Nazarene are one phenomenon. They depend on each other. The stream must run dry when the spring becomes clogged. And Christianity would become petrified if the Jews, God forbid, should cease to exist. And just as the spring loses its value, becomes spoiled and moldy when it's lost its mission and does not water the stream, so Jewry itself would become petrified, barren, and dry if there were no Christendom to fructify it. The two are one. Asch does his part to reanimate this fluid model of a relationship with his Christological trilogy, beginning with the Nazarene. It's the most readable of the three novels. Bad news, it's also the longest. It comes in about 700 pages. I know. You're not going to read it. It's okay. That's my job. The Nazarene makes for some demanding reading. It's a decidedly odd combination of historical fiction and fantasy with an elaborate frame that ultimately collapses under the weight of the epic narrative it seeks to contain. Now, surprise, surprise, it's really difficult to summarize. The novel begins in Warsaw, sometime during the early part of the 20th century. The narrator, a young, unnamed Jewish scholar, meets an elderly, notoriously untrustworthy, brilliant, and viciously anti-Semitic scholar of ancient Near Eastern texts named Pan Wiadomski, who needs help translating a mysterious, newly discovered scroll. But before learning of any of this, the reader gets a little meditation, which is a kind of midrash on a well-known exegetical story. The Nazarene begins this way. Not the power to remember, but its very opposite. The power to forget is a necessary condition of our existence. If the lore of the transmigration of souls is a true one, then these between their exchange of bodies must pass through the sea of forgetfulness. According to the Jewish view, we make the transition under the overlordship of the angel of forgetfulness. But sometimes it happens that the angel of forgetfulness himself forgets to remove our memories, the records of a former world, and thus our senses are haunted by fragmentary recollections of another life. So that's the beginning. With this kind of preface, the reader is immediately put on notice that the narrative to follow is highly unreliable, and one should quickly dismiss any expectation of historical veracity. By foregrounding the highly speculative nature of the narrative, Asch quickly introduces elements of both uncertainty as well as speculative possibility into the narrative, which I think characterizes the Jewish-Christian Borderzone. A few pages into the Nazarene, the fantastical elements become quite pronounced. Inspired perhaps by, if any of you have read James Joyce and know about what he says in Ulysses, metempsychosis, which is the transmigration of souls, and reincarnation is the key ingredient in Joyce's characters' efforts to escape what Daedalus famously calls the nightmare of history. Asch reaches for a similar strategy in order to imagine an alternative to the history of violence that has long colored Jewish-Christian relations. For Wiadomski reveals to the young Jewish translator that he is actually Cornelius, Syriarch of the Antoni in Jerusalem, second in command to Pontius Pilate, reincarnated. And it was actually he, quote, who had directed the execution of that mysterious personality whose nature has remained unexplained to our day. Guess who he's talking about, right? Unsatisfied with that cryptic disclosure, the Jewish translator presses for an answer and learns to no surprise that we are talking about Yeshu of Nazareth, who is called Jesus Christ. The next 625 pages are given over to an elaborate imagining of the young charismatic rabbi's rise from an especially compelling itinerant teacher to a political religious force with which to be reckoned. But there is more. Imbuing this rabbi of Galilee with nearly superhuman powers, even while he's wearing a talit and a tefillin all the whole time in the novel, not to worry. Asch tests that boundary between Jewishness and Christianity, which depends on a wholesale belief in or rejection of divine incarnation. It's an arresting move, but importantly, not without precedent. For Sholem Magid has shown us the idea that the gulf between the God and the human may be traversable, and that perhaps God is, quote, in the human, is woven throughout early Jewish mysticism and becomes quite pronounced in the 17th century with the flowering of Hasidism. In other words, Asch extends an opportunity, at least for me as a reader, to re-examine entrenched assumptions about what sorts of beliefs are and are not authentically Jewish, making a space where these kinds of revisionary accounts become more visible, so that some of these basic mysteries and precepts of the Roman Church might not be fully original or at least distinct from earlier Jewish precedents and thought. Asch's interest in expanding the Jewish-Christian Borderzone, a space where distinctions become less absolute, arguably overrides his aesthetic sensibilities. For while Asch was typically known for his well-crafted but conventionally structured stories and novels, the Nazarene seems to demand something else of the reader. And so Asch goes to great lengths to dismantle the framing of a device which might have given us some kind of ironizing distance. About 2/3 through the novel, the Jewish translator-narrator is prodded by, quote, the wizardry of Voyadomsky's own memory into recalling his own repressed past. That is, the frame collapses entirely as the narrator becomes an active participant. The rest of the novel is presented as a collaborative affair, crafted out of Voyadomsky Cornelius's recollection of the fateful days leading up to the crucifixion, and those of the translator himself, who it turns out is a reincarnation of Yochanan, a pupil of Rabbi Nicomedean, and a witness to Yeshu's last days. Weren't you waiting for that? Well, Asch doesn't go as far as making Yochanan one of the Nazarene's actual disciples. Even though his name conjures up John, it certainly is most sympathetic to the miracle worker's alluring vision. Now, to leave it here might suggest that Asch's representation of the Jewish Jesus is richly detailed, but finally not all that different from other artists, including his friend Chagall, who seeks to disable anti-Semitism by reminding his viewers of the shared history, linking perpetrator to victim. For Chagall's image of the Jesus on the cross is clearly situated in a readily recognizable Jewish environment, the shtetl, there's the burning shtibel, the little synagogue, and a hunted man carrying a Torah scroll. And so the Jewish-Christian divide remains intact. But Asch's account of Yeshu's last moments makes for something more unruly, more, again, one of my favorite words, messy. Dying on the cross, and this is from Asch, quote, the rabbi lifted his eyes to heaven and moaned bitterly, and from his lips came the cry, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Okay, so far all is according to history, as scripted in the New Testament. But this is not where Asch's rabbi's story ends. According to Asch, this famous cry is only Jesus' penultimate utterance and not his last words. The Nazarene ends this way, quote, upon hearing the rabbi's anguish, an unidentified woman answers his cry with words of comfort. Tinoki, Tinoki, my little one, my baby, right? The rabbi's despair and death terror then give way to calm. And, quote, with a last effort, he looks up again at heaven and in a loud, clear voice called, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." In other words, Jesus is saying the Shema, the best known of Hebrew prayers, which is also traditionally uttered at the moment of death. With this radically inclusive scene, a scene that effectively unfixes Yeshu's identity as definitively either Jew or Christian, for here I think Jesus melds into Rabbi Akiva, and Asch undoes the binary that earlier polemicists such as the 19th century Rabbi Emil Hirsch, and I learned this here at the center, invoke in the service of making the case for Jewish exceptionalism. It's a decidedly disorienting conclusion, as Asch writes purposefully against what some critics have called a homogenizing history, seeking to dismantle the powerfully destructive forces that all too often fuel efforts to secure religious difference. Asch's penchant for nuanced equivocations make for a particularly sly conclusion, and one finds the narrator celebrating Jesus, and I'm going to get the word, he doesn't use the word tzaddik, he uses Henklicher, right? All right? Which is a Yiddish word that's more German, using the word for saint. So instead of recognizing Jesus as either son of God or a righteous man, a tzaddik, Asch avoids landing hard on either one side or another side of the religious divide. And he leaves us in the border zone. That's it. Thank you. Questions? If you have things to say, it would be lovely to hear you.
I will just have to be this hated person who is going to check the time and would suggest that perhaps we spend like 15 minutes talking here and then just move to
as you wish. It's
to Nosh and Schmutz, because we provide all sorts of nourishment after all. So let's keep it short so that we can continue with the reception, which is outside, and move forward.
There.
Dr. Shreiber, thank you so much for a fascinating lecture. As a reader of the Jewish New Testament,
yes,
it's one thing. It's one thing to read it and say, "Oh, there's some very interesting things in the New Testament, and it's very thought-provoking, and I think that there are teachings of Jesus that I might incorporate into my life." It's another thing to actually go to church and have that experience full on. It's like the difference between reading pornography and actually having sex. When you talk about this envy, is it a intellectual thing where it's thinking about Jesus, writing about Jesus, or is it actually Jews who say there are things in Christian worship practice that they either would like to incorporate or have incorporated or experienced?
So, talking in terms of the people that I look at in my work, or have I, sort of think about it? I mean, one of the interesting things is, to me, it's interesting, I might have mentioned it. So I did this, I went to a very large interfaith conference this past summer. And it was there that I was talking to someone about this project, and she's a Lutheran minister, and I was talking to her about the Jewish annotated New Testament, and she began looking at it. She hadn't studied it before. She's German, and she finished reading it, and she said, I'm very sad. And I said, why? And she said, I didn't know Jews were so frightened of the New Testament.
Oh. Okay. Yeah.
And it was a very interesting moment, kind of where I felt the gulf got really big, because she had assumed that there had been openness and interest in all of it. So your question is very important, but I'm not so sure it's so neat, because whether or not even being intellectually interested in it, because if you begin to be intellectually engaged in something, that can be disruptive, right? And in fact, it may be even easier in some ways to go to a beautiful mass on, Christmas Eve and appreciate the music and the pageantry and look at that as if it's a play, as opposed to really sitting and wrestling with the theological ideas. That could be a different kind of challenge.
Thank you.
Yeah, keep going.
First, I want to say thank you for a very illuminating presentation.
Thank you.
In asking my question, I'm going to say that for various personal and political reasons, I'm going to put my cards on the table and say that I am sympathetic to Jacob Blotstein. I would like to ask if in the Jewish interpretation of the New Testament and in the work of Boyarin, what kind of wrestling, if any, is there with the explicitly anti-Semitic passages in the New Testament, like the book of Matthew saying his blood be upon...
So there's a lot, and I really invite people to look at the book. It does a beautiful, beautiful job of showing kind of the layers of history that have gone on in building the apparatus of anti-Semitism, right? And I think that one thing I've learned and continue to learn is how much this was a matter, again, of constructed in language. And when you kind of go back to the text, I mean, there's wonderful scholars like Adele Reinhardt, who does a beautiful chapter on anti-Semitism in their, both, they're not up here, but both Marc Brettler and Amy Jill Levine are reading it as Bible scholars, right? And so one of the things, for example, Amy Jill does is, AJ she goes by, she's at Vanderbilt, and she makes a point of taking that book and going all kinds of places in the South, specifically speaking to small Baptist communities and other ones, to say, look, let's look what your book says, right? Let's learn together as a way of dismantling anti-Semitism, which is a powerful project. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention another play that Sholem was a playwright as well.
Yes.
And he wrote a play called Mit Strom, with the current, in which a young man is married to a young woman. They live with the woman's family, as was typical, and he's very religious. They're all very religious, and at a certain point he decides he has to leave and go to the secular world and see what's out there. So he leaves his wife and his child, and he does this for, it's not clear how long, and then he comes back, and the father-in-law says, well, what did you find? And he says, nothing.
Interesting. I think he was a very complicated man. I mean, the more I read, the more I realize how many contradictions there were. And it'd be I will look at that play. That's an interesting thing to consider. Thanks.
Yeah, during this period and directly afterward, so many Jewish publishers were putting out religious, confrontational, controversial, Seltzer, D.H. Lawrence, who's got Jesus doing all kinds of crazy things. You've got Secker, who picked up on that. You've got Alfred Knopf, anything anybody wants to do, I'm getting it out there. I mean, is there a profit motive? And of course, Samuel Roth, I don't even want to mention, with pornography and everything. So there's a world that's working in the background. Publishing world, which is, getting out of hand, maybe or maybe not. Maybe it's just free
I don't
expression.
know. I mean, it is interesting. In the earlier this afternoon, there's a young scholar who's working here, and he was suggesting that there was enormous issues kind of going on in the business end of publishing that I don't know much about, but
Well, there have always been Christian scholars of the Hebrew Bible. I mean, always.
Right.
Generally, Christian higher criticism was vaguely anti-Semitic, proof that the Hebrew Bible was inferior to the New Testament, et cetera, et cetera. What is new and within our lifetime is this development of Jewish scholars of the New Testament. It's a new item, and it's amazing how many of them are women.
I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
I'll have to give that some thought.
Amy Jill, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to think about
I
that,
heard
the
her give a
gender
lecture
story.
once at Union Theological Seminary on the parable of the Good Samaritan. And, you know, she knocked my socks off.
Yeah, she's
because she
terrific.
said it's a Christian polemic against Judaism. And she explained why in great detail. But what she's done in the Jewish annotated New Testament, which is remarkable, is that she takes the New Testament as it is,
Right.
and then just says, here Jesus is repeating Hillel, he's repeating the you know when he says
Yeah, no, it's a really
and here he's
remarkable.
making a unique claim, and the Christian scholars I know love it. They love
Yeah,
it.
it's changed conversations.
Yeah.
I think very much so. Yes.
Okay, let's have it as the last one.
Last one. And
Many
then
years
Pete.
ago, it's not a question, just a comment.
Yeah.
That many years ago, I asked J. Levin and a question that at the symposium, but many years ago. If Jesus would come back today, would he be comfortable in the church or
What a great question.
or in snow? And she said, he will go straight to the bar.
And with that,
Straight to the bar, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much, Maeera.